On the evening of February 19th, 1994, a nurse in a Southern California emergency room drew blood from a dying woman. And within seconds of pulling that syringe back, the nurse collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Then a second staff member went down, then a third. Within minutes, nearly 24 people inside of that emergency room were sick, dizzy, gagging, unable to breathe, and the entire ER had to be evacuated. Not because of a bomb threat, not because of a gas leak, not because of anything the hospital had ever trained for. It was because of the patient's blood. To this day, what was inside that blood, what those nurses and doctors saw floating in it, had never been fully explained. And the one piece of physical evidence that might have answered everything was thrown in the trash and destroyed before anyone thought to save it. This is one of the strangest medical mysteries in modern history, and it starts with a woman who just wanted the pain to stop. Gloria Ramirez was 31 years old and living in Riverside, California, a working-class city about an hour east of Los Angeles. Gloria had been diagnosed with cervical cancer roughly 6 to 8 weeks before. And depending on which account you read, she either hadn't started treatment yet or treatment had barely just begun. What is consistent across every source is this: the cancer was advanced. It was aggressive, and by mid-February of 1994, Gloria's body was losing the fight. In the days leading up to February 19th, Gloria had been nauseated, she'd been vomiting. She started a prescription for an anti-nausea medication called Compazine just a couple days before. But nothing was working. Her body was shutting down in stages. Her kidneys were failing under the burden of the disease, and that was cascading into everything else. So on that Saturday evening, when Gloria's breathing became shallow and her heart began to race, her family did what everyone else would do. They called 911. Paramedics from Riverside Fire Department arrived approximately at 7:50 p.m. What they found was a young woman in obvious distress, semi-conscious, barely responsive, and struggling to breathe. They loaded her into the ambulance, and by around 8:15 p.m., Gloria Ramirez was wheeled through the doors of Riverside General Hospital's emergency department. At that point, it's a sad case, but not an unusual one. The ER staff had seen terminal patients arrive in crisis before. They knew the drill, they knew their jobs, and they went to work immediately. What none of them could have known was that within the next 35 minutes, the code they were running on Gloria Ramirez would turn their emergency room into a hazardous materials scene, and some of their lives would never be the same. When Gloria arrived, the ER team moved fast. She was deteriorating in real time. Her heart rhythm was unstable, her breathing was failing, her blood pressure was plummeting. This was a full code. They intubated her, they shocked her heart, and they pushed a heavy cocktail of emergency medications through her IV. Lorazepam, midazolam, diazepam for seizure prevention, lidocaine and beryllium to stabilize her heart, plus calcium, magnesium, and bicarbonate to keep her blood chemistry from spiraling further. And at some point during this effort, while the team was fighting to pull Gloria back from the edge, a registered nurse named Susan Kane picked up a syringe, a large one, somewhere between 20 and 30 milliliters, and she drew blood from Gloria's body. This was routine. During a code, you draw blood to check what's happening inside the patient. Electrolytes, oxygen levels, organ function. It's one of the most basic steps in emergency medicine. Susan Kane had done it hundreds of times, and by this time, as the syringe filled, Susan noticed something. It was a smell. It was sharp, it was chemical like ammonia, but not exactly like ammonia. It seemed to be coming from the blood itself. Now, in an emergency room, there are a lot of smells. Antiseptic, bodily fluids, medications. It's not unusual for something to smell off. But this was different. It was strange enough that Susan paused, and then Susan fainted. She just dropped. Right there at the bedside, people rushed to help her. She was pulled away from the patient and moved to a gurney, and as the team tried to figure out what just happened to their colleague, a second clinician stepped in. Her name is Julie, and she was a medical resident. She's young, she's capable, and she's not the type to panic. Julie picked up that syringe that Susan had been holding on to, and she looked at the blood inside. What she saw didn't make sense. there were particles floating in it, small, yellowish white crystals like tiny flecks of something solid suspended in blood. Julie had never seen anything like this. Blood doesn't do that. Blood doesn't have crystals in it. She leaned in closer. She caught the same smell that Susan had, that sharp chemical odor, and then Julie's legs buckled. She went down hard. But unlike Susan, Julie didn't just faint. She began convulsing. Her body locked into tremors and spasms that she could not control. And then a third staff member also examined the syringe, and he later reported seeing the same crystals, those strange pale particles drifting in Gloria's blood. Interestingly, in his account, he didn't report smelling anything unusual, but the crystals were undeniably there. Multiple people saw them. And by now, the room was sliding into chaos. Not the organized chaos of a medical code, real chaos. Staff members were staggering, people were reporting sudden dizziness, nausea, difficulty breathing, and a feeling of their skin being flushed, of skin burning. One by one, like dominoes, clinicians started going down. The decision was made to evacuate. The entire emergency room, patients, visitors, staff, all cleared out. Remaining patients were moved to the parking lot, so a skeleton crew of just a few people stayed behind with Gloria, still working the code, now wearing gloves and keeping their distance from the blood and anything that touched it. At 8:50 p.m., roughly 35 minutes after she arrived, Gloria Ramirez was pronounced dead. But the nightmare in that emergency room was just getting started. In the immediate aftermath, the numbers were staggering. By most accounts, 23 hospital employees reported at least one symptom. 6 were transported to other facilities, 5 were admitted. But the spectrum of illness was wildly uneven, and this would become one of the most argued over details of the entire case. Some staff reported mild lightheadedness or brief nausea, that kind of thing that frankly you could attribute to actually being in a terrifying or chaotic situation. Working a full code on a dying patient while your colleagues are dropping around you is not exactly a calm Tuesday. But others, particularly those who had been closest to the blood, closest to that syringe, were seriously, objectively, medically ill. Julie, the resident who looked at the crystals in the syringe, was in bad shape. She spent days in the ICU. In the weeks and months that followed, she developed a vascular necrosis, a condition where bone tissue dies due to loss of blood supply in her knees. She developed pancreatitis, she suffered from breathing problems, and these aren't symptoms that you can fake, right? They're not symptoms that come from being scared. And another staff member also suffered prolonged and documented medical problems in the aftermath. And this is where the story splits into 2 very different directions depending on who you ask. When something goes wrong in a hospital, when staff gets sick on the job, investigations happen fast. In this case, multiple investigations launched almost simultaneously, and they would arrive at very different conclusions. First in the door was a hazardous materials team. They swept for common hazardous gases, the usual suspects, right? Hydrogen sulfide, chlorine, ammonia, carbon monoxide. And everything came back negative. The decontamination process began around 1 a.m., and the ER reopened roughly 6 hours later. As far as the hazmat team could tell, there was nothing dangerous in that air. Now, critics would later point out, and rightly so, that by the time the hazmat team arrived, the room had been evacuated for hours. The air had been circulating. Whatever had been in that room at 8:30 p.m. had probably dissipated by 11 p.m. Testing the air 3 hours after the fact was like checking whether it rained by looking at the sky the morning after. But at the time, negative results were negative results, and that set the tone for what would come next. Over the following weeks and months, 3 separate investigations dug into the case. The Riverside County Coroner's Office conducted the first autopsy on February 25th, 6 days after Gloria's death, and the way they did it tells you how seriously they were taking the possibility of contamination. They built a specially sealed airtight chamber. The pathologists wore full protective suits. They were essentially treating Gloria Ramirez's body the way that you'd treat a container of unknown biological or chemical hazard. What they found inside was consistent with what everyone already suspected about her cause of death. advanced cervical cancer that had caused her kidneys to fail, which in turn caused her heart to stop. There was nothing exotic in the autopsy that pointed to a foreign toxic as the reason she died. The coroner would eventually rule Gloria's death as natural causes: cardiac arrest and renal failure secondary to cancer. But that wasn't really the question, was it? The question was, what was in her blood that knocked out the entire emergency room? And on that question, the investigators hit a wall. California's Workplace Safety Agency, essentially their version of OSHA, conducted their own investigation. They went through the hospital's ventilation systems, its plumbing, its chemical storage, its cleaning supplies. They interviewed staff. They took samples from the body bag, from the air inside the sealed autopsy chamber, and their conclusion was that no evidence that any hospital chemical, nor cleaner, nor drug, no sewer gas, nothing in that building could have produced the fumes. They did find something in the air samples from the body bag and the autopsy chamber, an unidentified compound. It was nitrogen containing, some kind of amine, but when they sent it to the contract laboratory for identification, the lab couldn't match it to anything in their mass spectrometry reference libraries. It was quite literally an unknown substance, and the significance of that compound was described officially as unclear. Then came the State Department of Health Services, which took a different approach. They sent out questionnaires, they interviewed staff, and they ran correlations. And their conclusion, the one that would spark outrage, was that the most likely explanation was mass sociogenic illness. In plain language, it means mass hysteria. The idea was that a strong, unfamiliar odor in a high-stress environment triggered a panic response that cascaded through the room, producing real physiologic symptoms: fainting, nausea, hyperventilation, but from fear and stress, not from a toxin. Now, if you're Julie, if you're the woman who spent time in the ICU, whose knees are deteriorating, who can barely breathe, and someone from the state tells you that you're hysterical? That what happened to you was in your head? You can imagine how she felt. And Julie wasn't the only one furious. Gloria's family was devastated for a different reason. The investigation had been grinding on for weeks. Gloria's body couldn't be buried. The media was circling, and the implicit message, the one that nobody was saying out loud but everybody understood, was that Gloria somehow had done this, that something in her had poisoned those people. And the family felt that their loved one was being turned into a monster, and they hadn't even been allowed to lay her to rest. By mid-1994, the case was stuck. The coroner said natural causes, the workplace investigator said no building source, the state said mass hysteria, and yet there were these stubborn, undeniable loose ends. The crystals, multiple clinicians independently saw solid particles floating in that blood. Hysteria doesn't put crystals in a syringe. The unidentified amine compound found in that body bag, something was chemically present, something real, something nobody can name. And the severity of Julie's injuries, a vascular necrosis, pancreatitis, breathing problems that lingered for months, you don't get those from a panic attack. None of the official explanations could account for all three. And that's when a completely different team entered the picture. Scientists affiliated with Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, one of the most sophisticated forensic chemistry facilities in the country, began their own analysis. They weren't looking at ventilation systems or employee questionnaires, they were looking at molecules. They ran gas chromatography and mass spectrometry on Gloria's preserved blood and bile samples, and they found something: dimethylsulfone. If that name doesn't mean anything to you, that's okay. Here's what it is. It's a metabolic byproduct, the thing that your body produces when it breaks down a chemical called DMSO. Dimethyl sulfoxide, and DMSO is a solvent that some people use legally and cheaply as a home remedy for pain. You rub it on your skin and it penetrates deep into your tissue. It's sold at hardware stores and it's used in veterinary medicine. And in the early 90s, it wasn't uncommon for people with chronic pain, people like, say, a young woman with advanced cancer, to use it on their own without a doctor's supervision. Nobody had confirmed that Gloria was using DMSO, but the chemical fingerprint of its breakdown product was sitting right there in her blood. Now here's where it gets dark. The Livermore scientists didn't just find the byproduct, they built a theory, a chemical chain of events that, if true, would explain everything. The crystals, the smell, the fainting, the severe injuries, all of it. And the theory goes like this. Imagine Gloria in the days or weeks before February 19th, rubbing DMSO onto her skin, managing her pain. It absorbs into her body, her metabolism begins breaking it down, converting it from DMSO into dimethylsulfone. The compound would later be found in her blood. Now, normally this is harmless, but your body processes it and moves on. But Gloria wasn't normal. Her kidneys were failing, and her body couldn't clear waste products the way that it should. So dimethylsulfone would build up and build up and build up to concentrations far beyond what a healthy body would ever contain. When the paramedics arrived and gave Gloria supplemental oxygen, as they would for any patient in respiratory distress, that high-flow oxygen may have accelerated the chemical oxidation happening inside her body. Then her blood was drawn into that syringe. And here is a critical detail. Blood inside a syringe cools rapidly. It drops from body temperature to room temperature in moments. And at that lower temperature, the dimethylsulfone, which would have been dissolved in Gloria's abnormally concentrated blood, may have precipitated out of a solution and then crystallized. But that's not the part that poisoned the room. The theory's final step is the one that changes everything under the right conditions. Conditions involving oxygen, the body's own chemistry, and concentrations that should have never existed in a living person. Dimethylsulfone can undergo one more transformation. It can convert into a compound called dimethyl sulfate. And dimethyl sulfate is not a pain reliever, it's not a byproduct, it's one of the most dangerous chemical weapons ever synthesized. Dimethyl sulfate is what's called an alkylating agent. In an industrial setting, even tiny amounts in the air can cause immediate dizziness, collapse, respiratory failure, and loss of consciousness. At higher exposures, it causes chemical burns to the lungs, kidney damage, liver damage, and bone marrow suppression. Its vapor is nearly odorless at lethal concentrations, but at lower concentrations, it can carry a sharp, irritating smell. The symptoms of dimethyl sulfate exposure, all of them, line up almost perfectly with what happened to the staff at Riverside General that night. The dizziness, the fainting, the respiratory distress, the flushing skin, Julie's tremors and spasms, even the eye irritation that was later confirmed in all 4 of the most severely affected staff members. The Livermore scientists measured inorganic sulfate levels in Gloria's blood. Normal levels run somewhere between 8 and 35 micrograms per milliliter. Depending on the reference range, Gloria's blood measured approximately 590 micrograms per gram, roughly 20 to 80 times the normal range. That sulfate is exactly what you'd expect to find if dimethylsulfone had formed and then broken down in the presence of moisture. Hydrolyzed. So here's what may have happened in that emergency room in the space of a few seconds. Susan draws Gloria's blood. The blood cooled in the syringe. Dimethylsulfone crystallized out, those pale particles everyone saw. And in the process, a small but potent amount of dimethyl sulfate vapor was released directly into the breathing space of the people standing over it. Susan, who was holding the syringe, inhaled it first. She went down. Julie, who leaned in close, examined the crystals, got the next dose, and she went down harder. And from there, the vapor, even in small quantities, dispersed through the immediate area, sickening everyone nearby in proportion to how close they were and how deeply they were breathing. A dying woman's body, in its final collapse, may have involuntarily manufactured a chemical weapon. Not in a lab, not in a factory, but inside of a human being. The Livermore team published their findings in a peer-reviewed forensic science journal in 1997, and to their credit, they were transparent about the theory's weaknesses. The biggest one, that they never directly detected dimethyl sulfate itself. The compound is violently reactive. It breaks down almost instantly in the presence of moisture, which means it wouldn't have survived long enough to be found in the preserved tissue samples taken days or weeks later. Its existence in the theory is inferred from everything around it. The precursor they did find, the sulfate levels that were elevated, the symptoms that did match. but it's a ghost, visible only to the shadow that it casts. But even the scientists acknowledge the single weakest link in their chain. There is no well-established chemical precedent for dimethylsulfone converting into dimethyl sulfate under the conditions present in that emergency room. They proposed reasonable mechanisms. They argued it was plausible, but they could not point to an existing body of research and say, see, someone else did that, or that's been done before. And the one physical object that could have settled this question, the one piece of evidence that contained the crystals, the blood, whatever vapor was released at the moment of exposure, that syringe was thrown away. During the chaos of evacuation, in the rush to clear the room, somebody discarded the syringe that Susan used to draw Gloria's blood. It went into the waste. It was destroyed, gone. No one preserved it. No one sealed it in a container. No one even thought to, because in the middle of an emergency room evacuation with staff members dropping and patients being wheeled out into the parking lot, a used syringe is just another piece of medical waste. But that syringe was the Rosetta Stone of this case. If someone had capped it, sealed it, maybe frozen it, if the headspace gas inside had been analyzed, if the crystals had been identified, if the blood had been tested while it was fresh, we would know. We would know whether dimethyl sulfate was real or whether it was something else entirely. But instead, the answer went straight into a sharps container, into the biohazard bag, and into an incinerator. And it's never coming back. Gloria Ramirez was buried after weeks of delay. Her family eventually reached legal settlements, the details of which were not fully public. The lawsuits from staff were filed and fought. Julie spent years dealing with medical and professional aftermath, including the indignity of having her very real, very documented injuries attributed to hysteria by officials who couldn't find a better explanation. The honest truth is this: we will probably never know exactly what happened at Riverside General Hospital on the night of February 19th of 1994. The DMSO theory is elegant, it's scientifically grounded, it explains more of the evidence than any other single hypothesis, but it has a hole in it. One missing chemical step that has never been replicated, and that physical proof that could have filled the hole was destroyed before anyone understood what they were looking at. What we do know is that Gloria Ramirez was a young woman with terminal cancer who went to the emergency room because she was dying. She didn't ask to become a mystery. She didn't ask to become the toxic lady. She was someone's mother. She was someone's daughter. Someone who was in pain and afraid and running out of time. And in her final moments, something happened inside her body that science still cannot fully explain. Whether it was chemistry or panic or something that we haven't thought of yet, the fact remains that on Saturday night in Riverside, a woman's blood brought an entire emergency room to its knees. And the only evidence that might have told us why is sitting in a landfill somewhere, or was burned to ash 30 years ago. Some mysteries don't stay mysteries because the truth is hidden. They stay mysteries because the truth was thrown away. Thank you for watching this video. If you want to hear more of history's mysteries or life's disturbing discoveries, make sure you like, subscribe, and ring that bell for notifications. If you got any weird stories you want to share, leave them down in the comments. I will see you in the next one. Bye.